In this video, we'll be going over how questions work in Spanish, as well as the question words, and finally, how you would respond to each of these subject pronouns asking a question, essentially the form that you would respond in. So, to kick it off, let's talk a little bit about how questions work. Now, first thing I wanted to note is that they have an upside down question mark at the beginning of every question, and they work a little bit differently than English as well. So if we have a sentence with basically a non-interrogative word or a non-question word, the way that it's going to work is there really is no sort of indicator as to how it's, or as to if it's going to be a question or not. It's almost going to be said like a statement, except for with a little bit of a change in tone in order to kind of imply that it's a question. So, for example, if I were to ask the question, do you speak Spanish? The way that you would ask it in Spanish is, ¿hablas español? Should be a tilde right here, but sorry, I can't get that on my computer. So, ¿hablas español? Do you speak Spanish? But one thing that you may note is that hablas means you speak, and español means Spanish. So the literal translation of that would be, you speak Spanish. You speak Spanish. So you can see how in English we have that do you speak, that do right there, in order to indicate that we are talking about a question, but in Spanish that doesn't exist. In Spanish, they just straight up state it. And so the way to know that it's a question, there's basically a couple of ways that we can figure it out. The first is based on context. So let's say, for example, if I were a Spanish speaker, I came to the US and I needed some help, I could go up to anyone and say, ¿hablas español? And then that would kind of be taken as a question, just based in the context, right? If I come out, I speak Spanish randomly to someone and I say, ¿hablas español? That would probably be like, okay, they're probably asking me if I speak Spanish. Now, the other way as well is that they have a little bit of a inflection in the tone of voice in order to indicate that it's a question. We do this in English as well. For example, if I were to say, you ate today? That is perceived as a question, right? Not as a statement, not as you ate today, but you ate today. You can see that we have that little bit of inflection where we're going up at the top. That's going to imply a question. So I could say, ¿hablas español? You can see that we got a little bit of the inflection, and so because of that, that implies that we are asking a question. So the inflection in the voice and the context are the two main ways to tell if somebody in Spanish is asking a question, because as I said, they don't really have a question word like do. And so for a lot of questions where we're not actually using an interrogative word like any of these, it's basically said almost exactly the same as the statement, except for in the context it could signify a question or with that inflection. So now that we've gotten over how question words work, let's talk a little bit real quick about this upside down question mark. It seems a little weird, right, that it's starting with an upside down question mark. Well, the reason why is basically to show that we should be reading the following statement as a question. Because as I said, they don't have a word like do in Spanish in the sense to indicate a question. And so in order to show that you should be reading the next statement from the beginning as a question, they put this upside down question mark. So for example, if I had a super long sentence, I could read the entire thing as a statement and then get to the end and see the question mark and be like, oh shoot, that's a question right there. But in order to indicate to the reader that, okay, whatever's going to be following this is going to essentially be a question, you put that upside down question mark at the beginning. But I will say that, for example, when I text in Spanish, I don't see it a lot. It's more informal usage, I would say. Although you'll see some people that also do use that in texting. Now, moving on, let's talk about some of these question words and translate each of these. So these are very important to know, especially if you are in Spanish class, because on a lot of the tests, these are going to basically be, the questions are going to be in Spanish, right? So you should know exactly what's being asked. Because of that, you should know the question words. So let's start with que. It's going to mean what. Then quién is going to be who. Quiénes is also going to be who, but it's a plural version of it. So for example, if you were to say, who is on the team? Or we could say, do you know who, actually that's not a good one. We'll say like, who were the culprits? Who are the culprits? We would use quiénes because we know that we're talking about a plural version of people, right? So basically, if we are referring to a sentence that has some sort of plural noun, quiénes is referring to some sort of plural noun. For example, with the culprits in that sentence, we would use the word quiénes. Quiénes. Next one is going to be cuál, which is which, and cuáles, which is also which, but it's going to be plural. Now, this is going to work the exact same as quiénes. With cuáles, I could say, for example, which are your favorite sodas? In this case, since I'm talking about sodas, multiple of them, we would say cuáles. Versus if I were to say, which is your favorite soda, we just use cuál. Next, we're going to look at cuándo. Cuándo means when. Next, dónde, where. A dónde also means where, but it basically means to where. To where. And so, essentially, if I were to say a question such as, where is the mall? That we would use dónde. ¿Dónde está el centro comercial? Versus if I were to say, where are you going? In this case, you are going towards somewhere, and because of that, we would use a dónde. A dónde vas? Next is going to be de dónde, which also means where, but it means basically from where. From where. So if I were to say de dónde eres, that would mean where are you from, or from where are you, the literal translation. And so basically all three of these can mean where, but we use them in different contexts. This is when we're implying that someone's going to somewhere, and then this one's when we're implying that something is some from where. Someone or something is some from where. Next, cómo, how. Por qué will mean why. Para qué means for what. Cuánto is going to mean how much. Cuánta also means how much, but when we're talking about feminine things. So, for example, if I were to say, let's say, how much water do you have? ¿Cuánta agua tienes? Versus how much coffee do you have? ¿Cuánto café tienes? And so it all depends on what the how much is talking about. If it's talking about a masculine noun, it's going to be cuánto, or a noun that we don't quite know, it's also going to be cuánto. Or if it's going to be a feminine noun, then it's going to be cuánta. Next, cuántos and cuántas is going to be how many, and then how many feminine. So it kind of makes sense how much is going to be referring to something that is essentially singular, or that we don't have multiple of them, right? It's just one group of it. So if I were to say, how much water do you have? Versus how many is implying that we're talking about something that is plural. So if I were to say, how many people are there? ¿Cuántas personas hay? And once again, just following the same exact rules. And an easy way to remember this is if we look at an English word with a Latin root, quantity. The quantity of something is how much or how many there is of something, right? So cuánto, cuánta, cuántos, and cuántas going to mean how much and how many. Now, a quién is to whom, and con quién is with whom. With whom. And so these are the question words in Spanish, but an interesting thing to note is that a lot of these actually lose their accents when we're not talking about them in question contexts. So for example, if I were to say, the mall is located where the center of the town is, in that case, when we use donde, don't use it with an accent. A lot of times with these accents, it's just going to be when we're talking about it in the sake of a question. Now, finally, we're going to be talking about the forms of asking and then how we would respond to each of these. And I wanted to go over this because I see this being a problem with a lot of students, especially when we're talking about ustedes. So first, if I were to ask a question in the yo form, let's think about what form we would respond. So for example, if I were to say, soy alto, am I tall? The way we respond, right, is sí, eres alto. Or sí, tú eres alto. And so in this case, it's going to be the tú form. It basically means, yes, you are tall. Because we're replying with you, we would be responding with tú. Could also be usted in certain cases, but that's only when we're talking about someone that is in a formal context. Now next is going to be the exact opposite. If I were to say, do you speak Spanish? We'd reply, yes, I speak Spanish, right? ¿Hablas español? Sí, hablo español, because that will be responding to any question asked in the tú form with the yo form. Next, the él and ella form. If I were to say, is he tall? Yes, he is tall. Or the same thing with she. So we were responding with él and ella once again. Next is the usted form. You're going to be replying in the yo form. If I were to say, usted es el maestro, are you the teacher? Say, sí, soy el maestro. Yo soy el maestro. It's replying in the I form, right? It's going to be yo. Next one is nosotros. So if I were to say, nosotros somos rápidos. Are we fast? We would say, yes, you guys are fast. Because of that, we have to reply in the you guys form. Now this tends to be a very forgotten one in Spanish, but the way to say you guys is going to be ustedes. A lot of people think it's they, and I think teachers do a very bad job at clarifying that a lot. Ustedes. It can also be vosotros if you're learning Spain Spanish, but that's only Spain Spanish. Usually it's going to be ustedes. Next is ellos and ellas. Going to be the same, kind of as the él and ella, right? If I were to say, are they scientists? Yes, they are scientists. So we're replying once again with the ellos and ellas form. And finally, the ustedes form, going to be replying with the nosotros form. So if I were to say, are you guys on the moon? Yes, we're on the moon. You can see that we're replying in the we form. Because of that, we would use nosotros. And so I just wanted to go over this real quick, because a lot of times you might see on tests or just in regular everyday conversations when you're speaking Spanish, that when you have to reply to a question, you should know how to conjugate the form that's coming after you. We should know the form that we should be responding in. And so this is going to basically be your complete guide. But one thing that I would say as well is it's not too tricky. All you have to do is think about, okay, let's translate this question first. Let's form a response in English first, and then translate that response over to Spanish. So we have to think, okay, how would I reply to this in English? And the form that we would use to reply to it in English is the form we will use in Spanish. So overall, that's basically how questions work. Thanks for joining. See you guys in the next one.